She told me to sit down. I told her only if she sat with me. What happened next changed everything. The classroom was quiet in that lazy, late-afternoon way that made the sunlight seem almost golden, pouring across the desks in slanted stripes. I sat near the back, pretending to focus on my notebook, but my attention was elsewhere. She moved at the front of the room with a calm authority that made it impossible not to notice her. There was a grace to her every motion. The way she adjusted her glasses, the soft sway of her hair as she leaned over a desk, the gentle rhythm of her voice as she explained the lesson. I could feel my own heartbeat picking up pace, though I tried to convince myself it was just excitement about the subject. But the truth was simpler. I was captivated, not just by her beauty, which was understated and confident, but by the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from her. She was composed, knowledgeable, and clearly comfortable in her own skin. And yet, beneath that confidence, I sensed a trace of vulnerability, like a faint tremor in her tone when she laughed softly at a student's joke. When she spoke, I noticed small details, the faint perfume she wore, a mixture of warm vanilla and something fresh lingering in the air, the way sunlight caught the highlights in her hair, the slight curve of her smile that seemed meant only for those paying close attention. I told myself to focus, to take notes, but I couldn't help stealing glances, and when our eyes met, I felt a subtle electricity, a quiet spark of connection. The moment that started everything happened unexpectedly. She called out to me, her voice calm but firm, "Sit down." I blinked, caught off guard, and before I could think better of it, I muttered a reply under my breath, half in jest, half in impulse. "Only if you sit on me." The room seemed to pause, though it wasn't a loud interruption. She simply raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into the faintest smile. There was amusement there, subtle, private, like a secret meant only for the two of us. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, realizing I had crossed a line without quite knowing it. But the tension wasn't uncomfortable. It was electric, charged with something both playful and forbidden. She returned to her lecture, but I noticed her watching me from the corner of her eye. My pencil trembled slightly in my hand as I pretended to write, aware of the warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with the classroom temperature. Even the ordinary sounds, the scratch of pen on paper, the rustle of pages, the hum of the projector, seemed heightened, more intimate, as though they were all part of the subtle dance we had just begun. By the time class ended, I was acutely aware of the way she moved around the room, how her presence lingered even after she left. That first exchange, brief as it was, planted a seed, a delicate, teasing tension that promised something more, something slow, careful, and impossible to ignore. And in that moment, I knew I was going to be thinking about her long after the bell rang. Every glance, every small gesture, replaying in my mind like the first line of a story I couldn't wait to unfold. The library smelled of old books and polished wood, a quiet sanctuary where the world outside seemed to slow down. I had come in for some extra study time, not expecting her to be there. And yet, as I rounded the corner of the history section, there she was, calm, composed, and impossibly elegant, flipping through a thick textbook as if she owned the room. She looked up when she noticed me, and that small smile, the one that lingered like sunlight through a window, made my chest tighten. "Need help?" she asked, her voice low, almost conspiratorial. I nodded, trying to play it cool, though my fingers drummed nervously on the spine of the book in my hands. We sat across from each other at a long wooden table, the afternoon light spilling over the pages. The proximity alone was electric. I was acutely aware of her scent, subtle yet intoxicating, the soft brush of her hair as it fell over her shoulder, and the quiet authority in her gestures as she explained a complex point. Her fingers brushed mine lightly as she passed me a notebook, a fleeting touch that sent a small shiver up my arm. I decided to lean into the tension, my voice light, but teasing. "So, if I get all the answers right, do I get a reward?" I asked, keeping my gaze on hers. She raised an eyebrow, the faintest smirk tugging at her lips. "A reward, huh? And what did you have in mind?" The teasing was mutual, a delicate back and forth that felt like a dance. Every pause in conversation was weighted, every glance deliberate. I noticed how her eyes softened when she laughed quietly at one of my offhand remarks, how she leaned slightly closer to point at a passage in my book. There was an intimacy in these small movements, a subtle acknowledgement that we were sharing a space beyond the ordinary. I caught myself stealing glances at the curve of her shoulder beneath the sweater she wore, the graceful way she tilted her head when she listened, the warmth that seemed to radiate from her presence. Each detail heightened the awareness of the space between us, the tension unspoken yet undeniable. When I handed her a pen, our fingers brushed again, this time just enough to linger for a heartbeat. It was innocent, almost accidental, but charged with meaning. My mind raced, trying to reconcile the thrill of proximity with the knowledge that this was a teacher-student dynamic. And yet, that tension made it all the more tantalizing. By the time we packed up to leave, I felt lighter, though my chest still carried that fluttering warmth. She gave me a nod, an almost imperceptible acknowledgement of the connection we had shared during those quiet hours. That day in the library, the playful challenge, the lingering touches, and the subtle smiles deepened something inside me, an awareness that what had started in the classroom was now growing, slowly, delicately, into something far more meaningful. And as I walked home, the soft weight of her gaze seemed to linger on my back, like sunlight on the skin long after the day had ended. I realized that this wasn't just a fleeting crush. It was the beginning of a slow, intricate dance, one that would test patience, boundaries, and the quiet courage of both our hearts. That I sat on the edge of my bed, the room dimly lit by the soft glow of a desk lamp. The day's events played over and over in my mind like a movie I couldn't pause. The teasing smile in the classroom, the brief but electric touch in the library, the way her voice lingered in my ears, all of it refused to leave me. My notebook lay open in front of me, scribbled with half-formed notes, but my pen had long since stopped moving. My mind was elsewhere, tangled in thoughts I wasn't sure I was ready to confront. I tried to reason with myself. She's my teacher, after all, poised, experienced, someone I should admire from a distance. And yet, every time I recalled her smile, the warmth in her eyes, I felt an ache that was far more than simple admiration. I remembered the subtle brush of her fingers on mine, the soft tilt of her head as she listened, and the quiet laughter that had felt like it was directed solely at me. It wasn't just attraction, it was a connection that stirred something deeper, something I couldn't name yet. The age difference weighed heavily on my mind. I was barely in my mid-20s, still learning how to navigate life, while she carried an air of maturity and grace that came from experience. Could I, someone still figuring himself out, ever match her depth? The thought made my chest tighten, and yet, the more I tried to rationalize it away, the more persistent the memory of her presence became, like a gentle tide that refused to retreat. I ran my fingers through my hair, trying to sort through the swirl of emotions. There was admiration, yes, and desire, but also an odd sense of longing for comfort, for guidance, for a quiet understanding that I hadn't known I was missing. Her subtle gestures, the way she adjusted a stray lock of hair, the faint scent of her perfume lingering after she left, had etched themselves into my memory with an intensity that surprised me. And then there was the hesitation. Part of me feared crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Another part wanted to reach out, to test the fragile connection we had, to see if the teasing, playful tension could evolve into something real. I felt the conflict in my chest, the push and pull of curiosity and caution, longing and restraint. Every heartbeat seemed to echo with her presence, even though she wasn't there. As I lay back on the bed, the ceiling above me blurred into shadows. I realized that this was no longer just a fleeting crush. It was a quiet, simmering awareness of someone who had unexpectedly entered my life and stirred emotions I wasn't prepared to label. The internal struggle wasn't just about desire. It was about respect, fear, and the delicate line between admiration and something more. By the time I drifted off to sleep, her face lingered in my thoughts, a soft, impossible presence. And I knew, with a clarity that both thrilled and terrified me, that the next encounter would not be simple. My emotions were no longer just a whisper. They were a tide, rising slowly but insistently, and I couldn't ignore them any longer. The rain had started softly, a gentle patter against the windows, turning the world outside into a blur of gray and silver. I found myself sitting in her office, the familiar scent of her perfume mingling with the faint aroma of damp books and coffee. The classroom and library had been our battlegrounds of teasing and subtle tension, but here, away from the eyes of others, the atmosphere was quieter, slower, more intimate. She looked up from her paperwork, eyes meeting mine with that calm, unwavering gaze that had unsettled and fascinated me since the first day I noticed her. "It seems like you've been distracted lately," she said softly, her voice warm but tinged with curiosity. I wanted to respond casually, to brush it off with humor, as I usually did, but something about the rainy afternoon and the hush of the office made me pause. I spoke honestly, carefully about the pressures I've been feeling, the classes, the expectations, and the confusion I sometimes felt about where I belonged. She listened without interrupting, her eyes never leaving mine, her hands resting lightly on the desk. There was no judgment in her expression, only attentiveness and a quiet empathy that made my chest tighten. Then, almost imperceptibly, she shared a sliver of her own story, something personal and unpolished, a moment of vulnerability she rarely revealed. I noticed her fingers fidget slightly with the edge of a paper, the softness in her tone contrasting with the authority she always carried. It wasn't much, just a small opening into her world, but it was enough to shift the air between us. For the first time, she felt less like a figure of authority and more like a person whose heart carried its own uncertainties and hopes. Our conversation ebbed and flowed, delicate and careful, but each moment pulled us closer. I noticed the warmth radiating from her presence, the faint brush of her sleeve when she leaned over to point at a passage in my notebook, the subtle movement of her hair as it fell over her shoulder. Each small gesture, every soft glance, felt amplified, charged with a quiet intimacy that words could barely capture. There was a moment when our hands hovered close while passing a pen, neither of us pulling away immediately. It was brief, almost accidental, but it lingered in the air, a gentle acknowledgement of connection, of trust forming in the space between us. My heartbeat raced, but it was different from the tension of flirtation. It was steadier, warmer, grounded in genuine care rather than teasing excitement. By the time I left her office, the rain had intensified, drumming against the pavement, yet the world outside felt softer, more alive. I walked slowly, replaying the conversation in my mind, the quiet smiles we shared, the shared vulnerabilities that had made us human to each other. The teasing, flirtatious tension of the previous days had shifted slightly, deepening into a bond that was more than just attraction. It was trust, understanding, and an unspoken promise of care. That afternoon, I realized that the story between us was no longer only about the thrill of playful words or stolen touches. It had started to become something real, something worth navigating carefully. And in that realization, I found both excitement and a quiet peace, knowing that this connection, slow as it was growing, had the potential to change us both in ways neither of us could yet fully understand. The evening air was crisp as we walked together down the quiet streets near the school. The day's light had softened into a gentle amber glow, and the rain from earlier had left the pavement glistening, reflecting the fading colors of the sky. For the first time, it was just the two of us outside the structured confines of the classroom or the library. The world felt private, almost suspended, as if it had created a space for what we were about to confront. I struggled to find the words, my mind racing with thoughts I had rehearsed 100 times, yet now seemed impossible to articulate. The playful teasing, the subtle touches, the lingering glances, all of it had led to this moment, where my emotions could no longer remain hidden. I stole a glance at her, noticing the soft curve of her lips as she smiled slightly, and the gentle way her hand brushed against the strap of her bag. Every detail reminded me of how careful, how composed she usually was, And yet tonight, she seemed as human and vulnerable as I felt inside. I, I enjoy being around you, I said finally, my voice low but steady, more than I probably should. The words felt heavy as they left my mouth, a mixture of confession and uncertainty. I looked down at the wet pavement, feeling my chest tighten with the fear of rejection. She stopped walking and turned toward me, her expression softening. Her eyes held something I hadn't seen before. Honesty and hesitation intertwined with warmth. I feel the same, she admitted, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. But there are things we have to consider. She glanced away for a moment, then back at me. The age difference, the expectations, everything. I can't ignore that. I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and frustration. Relief because she felt the same, frustration because the world seemed to insist that connection like ours must remain unspoken. I reached out instinctively, brushing my hand against hers in a tentative, grounding touch. The warmth of her skin sent a shiver through me, and she didn't pull away. Instead, she let our hands linger side by side for a heartbeat, a quiet acknowledgement that despite hesitation, we were here together. We continued walking slowly, neither of us rushing, both of us aware of the fragile tension between desire and propriety. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with the unspoken understanding that we were navigating something rare and delicate. Every step we took was measured, as if we were learning to walk together on unfamiliar ground, balancing honesty with restraint. Eventually, she gave a small, almost shy smile. "I don't know what the future holds," she said softly, "but I want to see where this connection goes." Carefully, slowly, her words mirrored my own thoughts, the same mix of excitement and caution. We shared a lingering look, eyes locking, the weight of everything we hadn't said settling between us. I felt the subtle warmth of her hand as it brushed mine again, a quiet but undeniable promise. The confession had been made, the hesitation acknowledged, and yet there was comfort in knowing that we were stepping forward together, cautiously, with mutual care and understanding. As we finally parted for the night, I walked home with a lightness in my chest and a quiet anticipation. The emotional tension had reached its peak, but it had also opened the door to something more profound, a connection built not just on playful teasing, but on honesty, vulnerability, and the careful navigation of hearts willing to take the risk together. The cafe was quiet that afternoon, sunlight streaming through tall windows and warming the wooden floorboards. It had become our little refuge, a place removed from the expectations of school, from the curious eyes of classmates, a place where time felt slower, more deliberate. I arrived a few minutes early, my chest fluttering as I anticipated seeing her, and when she walked in, the familiar calmness of her presence immediately filled the space. She spotted me instantly, and her smile, gentle, knowing, full of quiet warmth, made the nervousness in my chest settle into a comforting hum. She walked over, her steps measured, her eyes meeting mine with an ease that made the world feel both vast and impossibly intimate at the same time. We sat at a corner table, close enough that our shoulders brushed lightly when we leaned forward to look at the menu. The touch was innocent, casual, yet it carried the memory of every previous brush of fingers, every fleeting contact in the classroom or library. I noticed the way sunlight caught the subtle highlights in her hair, the curve of her lips when she laughed softly at one of my tentative jokes. For a while, we didn't speak much, letting the comfort of proximity do the talking. The warmth of her presence, the steady rhythm of her breathing, the faint scent of her perfume, all of it wrapped around me, grounding me, making me feel like I was exactly where I was meant to be. I caught her hand lightly as she reached for her coffee, and she didn't pull away. Instead, she let our fingers touch, lingering just enough to let the connection settle between us. "I'm glad we're doing this," I said quietly, my voice a little hoarse with emotion I had held in for so long. She tilted her head, her eyes softening. "Me too," she replied. "It feels right, even if it's complicated." The words were simple, but the weight behind them was undeniable. We spent the afternoon talking, sharing thoughts, hopes, and small, personal stories. The conversation flowed naturally, punctuated by soft laughter and lingering glances. Every time our hands met on the table or our knees brushed under it, there was a quiet acknowledgement of the trust and affection that had grown between us. It was no longer teasing or playful flirtation alone. It had matured into something tender, something real. At one point, she leaned slightly closer, resting her cheek briefly against my shoulder as she laughed at a shared joke. The contact was light, but it carried the full measure of intimacy and care we had built over weeks of teasing, tension, and confession. I felt the steadiness of her heartbeat against my arm, a rhythm that mirrored the calm and certainty that had settled in my chest. As the sun began to dip lower, casting golden hues across the cafe, I realized that the slow, cautious journey we had taken, the teasing, the vulnerability, the hesitation, had led us to this simple, profound moment of connection. The age difference, the social expectations, the uncertainty, all of it mattered less now because we had found a rhythm together, a bond built on trust, mutual respect, and care. When we finally left the cafe, we walked side by side, fingers intertwined. The warmth of her hand in mine, the quiet comfort of her presence, and the soft exchange of smiles said everything that words could not. The story had reached its resolution. A slow-burn romance nurtured into a meaningful connection, leaving both of us with hearts lighter, spirits calmer, and an undeniable sense that this was only the beginning of something beautiful.